All right. So, hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a lecture on the one of the advanced front-end framework. So far we have learned, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery, and specifically JavaScript and jQuery was the main way that we make a web application, right? Like compared to a static website. Like if it was a static website, you just need typically HTML and CSS, but then to make an interactive application, which is essentially what user interface is about, we will have to use like JavaScript and jQuery. And today we're gonna learn a different way. And then for the next few lecture, we're gonna learn React. Interestingly, this is my first time to use React, so I'm pretty excited too. So yeah, before we going into React, I'm just gonna revisit revisit the assignment 4, which hopefully that you by now like submitted. Like maybe some of you are working on it, but basically this is what we built, right? So we have users. Let me actually annotate. So we got users and they interact with web application, and then it's going to show some data. And then there's HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the front end part, right? And then it interacts with server, right? Server, and then in assignment 4, we made an AJAX request, right? Of course, like, requesting HTML file, like images, like those are also requests. And then you get a response from the file server, but like we can also make an AJAX call to the server, and then server contains the app logic, which is for us, this was like a Node.js application, which was like basically server.js. And under the hood, like there is a database, which was like a Mongo database. So we were like, this was typical model view controller. So this is model, this is view, and this is controller, where view does not really know what's happening inside the model. Model does not know how their data is displayed, so there's no interaction between those two. And then controller take care of like the request and responses. So this is not exactly MVC pattern because like, model, like changing the model does not automatically update the view. You would have to do something in the front end part, which is like a rendered HTML. So this was essentially what we did in the assignment 4. So let me actually keep track of time. So, and also I know that like I spent extra time last lecture, so I'm going to try to, finish in time, although I may fail. Okay, so that is what we did in assignment 4, right? And looking back, there's some interesting things, right? So I don't know, some of you may have went into this issue is that, if you send wrong ID, like if you send index of array instead of like this randomly generated string, you get an internal error of 500, and then you are able to actually, like in the terminal, server actually crashes, right? Which is kind of my fault because I didn't expect that happen, and then I should have do the sanity check for that particular thing. But it's kind of amazing that like by sending certain data to a server, you can actually kill the server, right? Like, the server program crashes. So this is not a good example of the server program. Like the one that I made, I should have done much more rigorous sanity check for all the data that I get from the client, which is kind of my fault. Well, not kind of my fault, it was my fault. But it's, in practice, this is kind of like crazy. Imagine that I can send some sort of data, like by like sending get, like, get method, get Ajax call, and then typing something wrong. Imagine that I can kill like facebook.com or something, that's like crazy, right? So that's something that I wanted to point out before I move on, because that happened. And then like typically it's more of a backend programmer's responsibility to make sure to safeguard the server from any kind of attack from the client. Like, that could be seen as an attack, right? If server dies because of the inaccurate like parameters from the client, that's like, that's not good, right? So that's one thing that I found very interesting that I wanted to point out during for the assignment 4. One of the things that you might have felt is that like, why do we have to render everything all the time when there's only one change? Like, even the approach that I was suggesting is that if there's a certain change in the data, like let's say it's like a task item is completed, and instead of, what I could have done is like simply update that particular task item and then to make it green, and like to add the check, like, check mark, and then add the complete date. I could probably pinpoint that particular element and then update the content. Instead, what I did, like what I suggested you to do is to, hey, delete everything and completely render everything. So some of you might have felt that that's like, inefficient, which is true. Like that's not the most efficient thing. But the other way to do is like, selecting one thing and then like, updating one thing, and then it's going to look like something like this. Like, event handler is going to, you would have to pinpoint one DOM element and then change the content. And then maybe one event could if influence multiple different elements. If that's the case, you would have to change multiple different things. So let me give you an example though. So one example that I can give you is like a tweeter. So if I want to tweet something, and then if I write down, you see that like this is updating this like, knob thing. And if I keep updating, keep typing thing, and then, oh, this is like one of my plugins, so don't worry about it. But if I do this, it's gonna update this like, one thing, like this number. And then you see that adding more letter is going to change multiple different things. So it is changing this like, number here, and then it just disabled the tweet button because they don't want you to tweet like something longer than 140 letters. So if I delete it, it's going to enable the tweet button. But if I add one more letter again, it's going to disable this tweet button. But also the other thing is that like, whatever I type over 140 is going to have this red highlight. So imagine, using jQuery, imagine that like updating multiple different things, it's gonna look like a jumbled code. So that's and then this event is basically key press. Like whenever someone pressed the key and then they would have to check if it's over 140 or not. If it is, if you have to change multiple different DOM element, which is going to make it look make the code pretty complex. So how do we fix this? So this React is going to somewhat resolve this thing. So like we're going to learn React, not not rigorously, but to some extent. So imagine jQuery style is something like this, but React could kind of like take care of all the mundane like rendering elements, HTML elements automatically. So if something happens, what we need to do is to keep track of state that changes depending on the event, and then whenever React is going to automatically update the HTML elements if the state that we care about changes. So remember in assignment 4, whenever something changes, we always have to fetch data and then render task. That like rendering task will be automatic, and then remember that in our case, render task was going to it's going to like delete everything first of all, and then like render everything from scratch. Instead, React is going to update, automatically update that particular element that has the state change. So it's not going to start from scratch, and it's going to only update the relevant elements. So yeah, so let's look at the React. Okay, so let's move on. So before we go into the React, I would like you to remember this particular slide that we looked at, I think in week 3, and then it changes. I think we use this to differentiate API, framework, and library. So jQuery is something like a library, like something that we include in your code, and then you will be able to call the function, like helper function inside the library, and then API, it's communicating with other apps. And then like I hope you guys watched the lecture last time. So it's like communicating with other services, other products, other web application to retrieve data, for example. And then framework is basically something that kind of like a platform where your code can reside, and then it's completely going to change the architecture of your code, because now framework is going to call your code and refer your code, and you would kind of have to follow the architecture and structure of the framework. So it's almost kind of like a programming language. You kind of have to follow the syntax. So again, framework is a platform that dictates the architecture of your code and control the flow. And it's going to look completely different from what you have done so far. So it's not anymore like writing HTML code and JavaScript and CSS. It's going to be different. Framework often includes library, and then front-end framework, React, Angular, Vue.js is something that are popular. And there are back-end framework as well. And then we looked at Node.js and Express.js. So today we're going to look at React. So why would I use like front-end web framework? In general, it should be fast, like to use this again. So there's some gain in performance. So DOM element is slow and update, and then like imagine jQuery, and then imagine a very complex page, for example, like Facebook, and then think about this jQuery selector where you have to select one element, and then what it essentially has to do is like kind of like navigate all the HTML elements and then find a particular ID, which is kind of like a search algorithm, right? So if you have like infinite number of elements, it's going to be slower and slower. So instead of re-rendering everything, it will, like the advanced web framework will render the only elements that need to be updated. And then using a framework will force you to approach software development in a systematic and modular way, so that you can reuse your code and it's easier to maintain. So let's say you create a module, or like let's say you create an input form that works like a Twitter, and then if you have that module in HTML and JavaScript page, what you have to do to reuse it is to grab some part of HTML and then grab some part of a JavaScript file, which could be like code of the JavaScript could be distributed in multiple different spots in one file. So like, it will be difficult to reuse it. But like in web framework, like typically everything is modularized so that you can grab like two files and then use it some other project. You can actually have have the same component that has the same behaviors and same function. So it's much easier to reuse the code and maintain the code. Because again, like because it's modular, let's say this particular module is being used in multiple different projects, but if I change it here, it's going to update the multiple different projects automatically. Whereas if it was like a HTML and JavaScript, and even if you have same module, like same input form in 5 different HTML pages, essentially you would have to like update 5 different pages, right? Even though it could be as simple as copy and paste. So it's more of a work to maintain a software project. So there's an error. So React is a JavaScript framework that is actually developed by Facebook. And then that makes building UI components seamless and easy using a syntax called JSX. The other way to think about it is that now HTML file is gone. You can inject HTML code into your JavaScript code. So you will only have JavaScript file and CSS file, and then JavaScript will use render HTML, kind of like in the way that you did it in assignment 4, like a render task is going to append lengthy HTML code to your HTML file, right? So to be able to do that, they have a syntax called JSX. We'll go into JSX in the next page. But why do we do React? Why do we choose React over Angular or Vue.js? There's something else for sure. Backbone.js, Blaze. Like there are a lot of front-end framework, but then like React is the most used one, and it is less opinionated. What I mean by opinionated is that because it's a framework has to have a fixed architecture, and it has to make some assumption that about some application, and but like if you want to build something that that kind of violates the assumption, you will not be able to use this framework. So React is comparably less opinionated than other framework. Yeah, and then you can see that here, it's kind of like jQuery used to be the primary way to build a web application, but like today React is more popular. But there's no reason to downplay jQuery. jQuery is great in terms of building a simple app, but if you want to build like a large scale app that's going to be used in a big company and then it's going to be used for multiple years, probably better to use React or any kind of web framework. So let's do hello world, and then there's a different way to build, like different way to build like React application. Of course, there's like you can do like HTML and then include React like files as if we include like a jQuery library. But like this is much more common way to do it. Like so we're gonna use something called Create React App, which is basically I think it's a Node. Is that a Node app, or is part of the Node function, Node.js, application, or npm? So it's going to create a boilerplate boilerplate code and project structure for React app. Again, like already it's kind of opinionated, right? Because it's going to give you some name of the file, like determine name of the file, name of the structure of the folder is determined by this particular app. So you'll need to have Node that is greater, the version of Node should be greater than 8.10, which is likely, like if you install Node for assignment 4, you should probably have the most up-to-date one. And then once you code this, I mean, there's a tutorial, but I'm going to show you. But basically there are two files that we can start from, which is index.html and under public, which is like a page template, and the index.js is the entry point of the JavaScript. So let's create one. Okay, so what do I do? Okay, let's open the terminal. Oh, I'm running it again already, but let me cancel that. So starting over. So I'm gonna go to my document folder. If I go up again. Okay, so I'm gonna go to my CS3744, and then now what I'm gonna do is create a empty React app, which I don't recall what the commands are. So this is the command, npx create React app and name of my app. So npx create dash React app, and then I'm gonna say 3744 demo is the name of the app that I'm gonna use. If I click it, and then it's gonna take about a few minutes to actually download anything. Oh, I have a project name, so interesting. Name cannot have capital letter, okay, which I didn't know. But now it's going to download everything, and then it's going to take a few minutes actually. It's not immediate. So it's going to install packages that React require, and then there are a bunch of other useful packages that are being installed, because like this is this particular npm package called Create React App is going to be useful for building a development application, for production application, and then there's a bundling thing. So this is, yeah, and then it's going to take a while again. And then I don't know if you can hear my the fan noise of my laptop. So once it's done, it's going to create a folder, and then it's going to have some variable structure. So folder structure this is going to be the name of the project that I've specified, and it's going to have README, and then of course, because this Node.js project, it's going to have node module, package.json, public, and sources. So you don't really see the server.js, but essentially it's going to run a static file server, which is actually pretty great, like because it's going to update whenever I change something in the code, the node like this Node.js server is going to detect the change and update, refresh the page, and it will even open the local host automatically. So okay, so happy hacking. So we suggest that you begin by typing these 2 lines. So let's do this. If I do this, that means that I'm going to change the directory to 3744 demo. So now I'm in this particular project in folder. And then what I'm going to do is npm start. And actually, this is not the one that I'm looking for. Okay, this is the initial code that the package provides. So this is something that this is not the code that I wrote. This is kind of like a boilerplate code that this npm package provides. So let's look at the folder structure. So I'm going to bring an editor. And then open that particular project. Again, it has, automatically even creates a Git repository, which we don't have to see. Node modules, like there are a bunch of node modules that are installed by default. And public is basically kind of like a static files. So index.html is like a template that we use, but like it's automatically generated and it has no content in it other than this div element with root. And again, if you remember these 2 lines, this is the page template, and the index.js under source folder is going to be the entry point. So if you go here, look at this index.js. Now this is JavaScript code, and then this is the React code. So what it says is React DOM render this HTML code, and then you're going to put this code in this root element. So before we go into that, let's look at the so render is basically a function that takes 2 parameters. So this is the first parameter is HTML code. And then you might wonder why do we have this like HTML tag that you never you have never seen. And then second parameter is where you're going to add this particular thing. So for example, if I do hello and then save it, hopefully is it going to? Interesting. Okay, maybe not. So edit source.app.js to save to reload. Okay, so we have to update the app.js, but basically this is like a starting point, and you can see that this is HTML tag is called app, and then this is not coincidence. Like this has to come from this app.js. So let's go to app.js, and this is you can see that this is simply a function that is going to return this. This is the whole thing that it returns, which is like probably the one that we're looking at. So let's say let's add our own code. This is 3744 demo. And then you can see that I didn't even refresh the page, but it automatically updates the page. So this, save it, and if I go to the web browser, it's already refreshed by default. Okay, so we're gonna, so this part is something new. Of course, like, there's a lot of things that looks new, like, import, export, like, but this is basically to be able to use some other code in this particular JavaScript file. And then, so import is being able to use something else. And then export is letting other code use this app code. So without this, if I cut this part and then save it, it's gonna give you an error. App does not contain a default export, so it's gonna complain. So because we have export, index.js can import the app and then import the app.js, and then that's how they can use this particular HTML tag. Okay, so before we go into detail, let's talk about this JSX. So we did create hello world. So what is JSX? JSX is kind of like a new syntax for JavaScript, a syntax extension to JavaScript. So it's only going to work in React code. It's not going to work in other types of like pure JavaScript code. So it's a HTML-like syntax used by React that extend ECMAScript so that XML, HTML-like text can be coexist with JavaScript and React code. So basically what it means is that inside JavaScript code, you can assign HTML code to a certain variable. You don't need like double quotation, as long as it starts with like, this, greater than sign and less than sign, and it's gonna work like an expression or number or even. So HTML, like the benefit of this is that now in JavaScript, HTML can have a power of programming language. So HTML itself is not a programming language, but now because it can be embedded in JavaScript, like, before it was the only way to embed HTML is like use it as a string, but now this is like, syntax that can be parsed by React program. And it's kind of like similar to template, but it's much more powerful. One difference is that because some of the property name has conflict with JavaScript keywords, for example, class, we cannot use class anymore. We have to use class name. So this is something that we have to be familiar with. Like class cannot be used because, again, JavaScript has a class keyword and then if we start to use class inside the JSX code, like the JavaScript is going to parse it like incorrectly. So we have to use class name, which is like so this is again reserved word. So you have to follow this comma capitalization. So let's use, so let's go back to the code and let me escape. So this is essentially JSX code, and then if you want to put multiple lines, it's kind of like a I guess convention to have like parentheses. So instead of this, let's just make it simpler by saying hello world. And then you see that it is using class name instead of class. And why do they use class name? It is because this sometimes you have to use like CSS file. So here is a CSS file, particularly for this particular app. And then if you go to app.css, you're going to be able to see like code, like CSS code, which we know already. So let's save it and then look at the code, look at the local host. Now it's going to be, hey, how do I, okay. Now we have hello world. Okay, so basically whenever we change something, it's going to be automatically updated. So you see, like if I change hello 3744 exclamation mark, if I save it, it's going to update automatically. And then you can see that like in the terminal is actually actively updating the localhost 30,000 by default. And sometimes it's going to give me the error messages, and then error message will appear here as well. And that's part of this, like, create React app package. Okay, so it looks completely different, right? So how is it happening? So again, if you go to index.html, this is the HTML code that is being rendered here. So if I React app, instead of, if I change the title, I don't know if you can see the title, it's a React app, but like if I change the title to 3744 demo, and then it's going to change the title automatically again. But then the only thing that it has, this div element, and then ID of this div element is root, and then index.js is going to include this JSX file. We're going to come back to this later, but this is the JSX syntax, and then it's going to add this JSX syntax to root element. So render function, the first parameter is JSX code, and then this is the position. And then what's happening here, this particular app is going to be replaced by what's returned by this app function. So we're going to talk about functional component, but this is like a main way for React to render HTML files. So you can create your own HTML. So like, in HTML, there's no HTML tag called app, right? especially with this uppercase, right? But this is something that I created because of this importing line, and then it's importing this index.js, like app.js, and then it has the function called app, and it is returning this JSX code, which will be replaced, which will replace this particular line. Okay, so let's look at the JSX more. So the power of JSX is programmable. So you can put any valid JavaScript expression inside this curly braces. So let's say you have a variable called name. Variable called name, and then you can put things like, you can actually put this variable, and then if you wrap with this curly brace, it's going to be replaced with this string. Also, it could be any expression such as this guy, 2 + 2, or you can call function, and then whatever this function return will go here. The other thing to notice is that all elements must be closed. So closed meaning that you have to have like end tag, but it is empty elements. Empty elements, I don't know if you remember, but empty elements, HTML elements are HTML elements that does not have content in it. It has to have this slash at the end. Without it, it's gonna we're gonna have an error. So let's just play with this JSX thingy. So let's go back. So here, let's go to the app.js. We can things like, this is function, but before we return something, we can create our own variable. So const, let's say my name is Sang-Won Lee, and then I'm gonna say from, and open curly braces, and then say my name. And then if I save it, if I go to the, and I have a, again, like I have to, this, because this line break is empty element, I would have to have this slash to close it. And then you can see this, okay. So, if I change this variable, let's say John Doe and Jane Doe, if I save it, it's gonna update the page, right? So you can actually, so imagine like this would have been really easy if you in the assignment 4, right? Or 3 even. So you can actually have HTML code in JavaScript and then replace certain part with like a JavaScript expression. And again, let's create random number, for example. Let's creating random number. I'm gonna put a breakpoint, not a line break, and random number is math.random, and I save it, and then it's gonna give me some random number between 0 and 1. If I refresh, it's gonna keep giving me random number every time that I refresh it. I can possibly create like a coin flip thing. So head or tail. And I'm gonna say, hey, if math random is greater than 0.5, I'm gonna say coin. Otherwise, I'm gonna say, hat, or I'm gonna say tail. So I don't know if you know this like syntax, like what is this called? Like this is condition operator. JavaScript. Conditional operator. So this is basically, you put like a Boolean expression inside the parentheses, and if it's true, it's gonna go with the first one. If it's not true, it's gonna go with the second one. And then you need this parenthesis, which I didn't even know. And save it. Tail, head. So if I keep refreshing, it's kind of like a coin flip function. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is that with this curly brace, you can put any kind of JavaScript expression that can be evaluated. So anything that could be evaluated in a console, you can just type it here. The other thing that I could do is like, because this is string, I could make it uppercase, and then this two uppercase is member function of string object, and then it's going to return the uppercase version of the string. Let's look at that. No, it is not a function. Maybe I need to do this. Cool. Yeah, so now it has capital letters. I could probably do lowercase as well. Okay. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this is kind of like a power-up JSX code. I can put up a curly brace and then put any kind of JavaScript expression inside of it. So yeah, that is that. One tricky thing is that, maybe not tricky, but, oh, what is this? Okay. You always have to have these double quotation for class name. So let's say if you do something like this, I think it's going to complain because JSX value should be either on expression or coded JSX text. So it always needs to be coded, like double coded. And I think it could be single coded. I don't know. Let me try that. Okay, single quotation works as well, but then simply not having double quotation is gonna produce an error because it always expect either expression or text. Okay, so that is that. So let me just come back to simple version. Hello, 3744. Okay, so next one that I have to talk about is component. So component is the main way to organize or even modularize code in React. So component is essentially like the purpose of the component is to basically create like a unit of UI components that has HTML elements and some states and behavior, event handler, and so forth. So components is kind of like a module of React. So it's not like in React, like in traditional HTML, JavaScript, JS, you write down everything in one file. But in React, you create a component to make your app application modular, and then you can have multiple components, like infinite number of components if you want. And then component is the main way that you can reuse, like make this React project reusable, because you can just grab the component and use it somewhere else and so forth. So it's going to modularize your code per component, and component can have other components inside, and components can have props and states. Props is basically shorthand for properties. So actually, this is the last slide of today. So let me show you functional component. Before we go into that, in React, there are two different kinds of components. Like one is functional component, which is basically what we saw. And there's class components. But like more modern way to do it is functional component. And React is like, React, the company is saying that we're going to move away from class component. And then at the end of the day, like functional component is going to be the primary way to write React. So we're not going to cover class component. I know some of you who already are familiar with React may know React with this class component, but I'm not going to teach it because it's kind of like it's likely to be obsolete, and it's going to be dead in more or less in some future. So what do I mean by functional component? Like it's basically a function. Like this is component. So I haven't told you, but this function app is component, and component has two parts. One is this function code, and the other is this tag, which has the same name. So let me actually motivate the needs of components. So let's come back to this nice idea of to-do list. So hello, I'm gonna say 3744 to-do list. And then what do I do? I'm gonna create input type checkbox. And then value is, do we need value, or maybe we don't need value? And then label is, what do I say? Buying toilet paper. And then let's save it, and it's going to give me an error because I didn't close this empty element. I should always close it, terminate the HTML tag. No. Okay, label. And this is not empty tag, so I have to close it. Now I have this, and it's probably a good idea to have its own development for items. Okay, now I have this. So let's create some more. To-do items, and let's put some due date. So I have to buy toilet paper by 18th. And then what else do I have to do? Assignment 5 will be released, and then it's due May, I don't know when, but maybe 4th. I'm not sure if this is going to be actual due date. What else do we have? What should I have? I'm preparing Joy-Con. My Nintendo Switch has a drift problem, so I would have to repair this Nintendo Joy-Cons, and I would have to do it ASAP, let's say. I saved it. Obviously, it would be nice to have another development. Just to have a line breaks. Saved it. Okay, so one thing that I don't like about this is the alignment. So this is aligned to center because of this, because it's coming from the CSS file. So let's look at the CSS, and everything is aligned to center, which is, fine for the header, but then I don't want that to happen for the to-do list items. So what I'm going to do is give it a class name. So this is the container that contains each item. So class name is to-do list. and then go to this CSS file, and I would have to name the class, and then text align left, save it. Okay, now it's on the one side of the page, so I don't like that. So let's set the width to maybe 50%, maybe too much, I don't know, 40%, and then margin, set the margin to auto, which is a neat trick to put something in the middle. I guess width is not enough, so I'm gonna say 60%, maybe 50%. Okay, so, and yeah, so basically this is me just keep adding JSX code, but then I realized that this is being repeated, this part. So what I'm going to do is to create components. Let me actually create a component for this whole entire to-do list. So let me create two different components, one for this to-do list and then one for each item. So how do I create a to-do list? So what I'm going to do is, again, this doesn't have to be this way, but I guess it's usually recommended to organize components in components folder. And then I'm going to create two components. So I'm going to create two folder, to-do list, and another folder called to-do item. So now it has two empty folder, and then I'm going to create a index.js for to-do item, and then to-do list index.js for to-do list. So here, what should I do? So to-do list, let's do the to-do list first. So I'm going to grab this guy just to use it as a starter code. So let's do the to-do list first. So first thing that we have to do is import React. And this is like default, by default you need this. And then we're not going to use logo, we're not going to use CSS. And then I'm going to create a function called to-do list. By the way, this happens to be the same, like it doesn't have to be exactly the same, So to-do list function is basically it is going to return part of this, like part of the main application. So I'm going to get rid of these two. And then this is the JSX code for to-do list. And I would have to export it to be able to let other code to use to-do list. So I saved it. And then here, now because I create a component, I can replace this whole code with component that I created. So what I'm going to do is, hey, the component that I created is called to-do list. And that's it. And then if you go, it's going to complain because to-do list is not defined. It is because we have to import it. And then the way that you import a component is we can do exactly the same as this app. So I'm going to grab this code and then come back here. So what I'm going to import is I'm going to import to-do list, and these two has to be same. And then where am I importing it from? I'm going to import it from components, and to-do list. If I do that, module not found. Do I have typo? Components, I have a typo here. COMPONENTS. Okay, NENTS. Saved. Now, interestingly, this particular HTML tag, which is basically my own custom HTML tag, is actually a React component, because, like, React component again is a pair of HTML tag and the function, and then it's going to look up this, because now to-do list is like a something imported from this particular folder, and then probably should have done index.js, but like index.js is the default name. So it's going to go here and then look for function called to-do list. So this I guess is common. I don't exactly know if this could be different. I don't think it is. Like if I say to-do list 2, and then it's gonna complain. And so this has to be same as this guy. Now it works like this. If I change this, it's not gonna work. So like the name of the function, name that we are exporting it to, name that we are importing, and the name of the tag, the HTML tag, those needs to be same. I think if we change this and if we change this to together, it might work. Yeah, it still works. Okay, so if I change this to this, it's gonna work. Okay, so these two has to match. So I don't know if it makes sense, but basically we create a component called to-do list, and then we create because we create a component, I can use HTML tag, which is custom HTML tag called to-do list, and it's going to look up for the function from the imported location, and then just get the CSX code that is returned by that function. Of course, you can do something inside this function, but basically this function is supposed to return JSX code. And then what I'm going to do here is that, hey, this is being repeated, so I'm going to create another component for this. So let's use to-do item for that, and then we have index.js. So what I'm going to do is copy this whole code and then go here and then paste it, and then like this. Now this has to be to-do item and to-do item. Now I want to just return one of the thing. But then I realized the problem is that, hey, these are different per component, right? Like this content, even though the format, like the structure is exactly the same, it's being repeated, the content itself it's different. So how do we vary this content? This is where props are useful. So by default, you can props will be passed from the HTML tag. So props is stands for property. So what's going to happen is that, hey, I'm gonna expecting props dot name, and then now this is because it's JavaScript code, I would have to use this curly brace. And then I'm gonna expect due date. So props is again property that is passed by the custom HTML tag. So we export it to the item. So in to-do list is still gonna work, but now this will be replaced with to-do item components. So to be able to do that, we would have to first import the components. So again, to-do item is coming from, let's see. I don't know if I have to use relative path or not. So let me just try to-do item. So if I save it, it's complaining because module is not found. Probably I have to, because this guy is not in the same level of components. So what I would have to do is go up one level and then find to-do item. And I think now it works. So I haven't used the components yet, but here what I'm gonna do is use this guy. And then properties is like an attribute of this particular HTML tag. So this to-do item, I'm gonna have property called name, and then it's gonna be buying toilet papers. And then due date is gonna be March 18th. And then close it. And something like this. And then I will just replace this guy. Accordingly. And then repair this, replace this. Then you can see that it can take any value and then get rid of it. And then now it works exactly the same. So we can now, I created a component called to-do item, and then I can generate this multiple items using this to-do item HTML tag. And let's give it a different value. What else should I get? Like buy webcam, better webcam with autofocus. I don't know if it's being autofocused or not. ASP, or maybe I wanted to buy today. And saved it. And now this is going to look for this part. Look like, because these has the same name, it's going to go to this file, which is this guy, and then look for functional components. So this is functional component, and whatever it returns, it's going to be replaced. It's going to replace this HTML tag, like custom HTML tag that we created here. And then these two are the properties that are being passed. So whatever attributes that this HTML tag has is going to be passed as props. And then props is basically an object that you can access each attribute using props.attribute name and props.attribute name. So yeah. So now I have another to-do items, right? And then I can keep doing this thing, like, let me create a, now I have 4. What if I create 8 of them? And yes, so let me find a webcam. I'm just going to make it shorter to make it look nicer, just for the sake of the demo. So yeah, so this is basically how React can modularize HTML code by creating components. So again, this is completely different from like the HTML tag, like HTML files that you have seen, right? What it is doing is starting from this top element, the root element, which is app, and app is going to call. I have some HTML tag, and then call this to-do list component, and then to-do list component is going to have one div element, and inside this div element is going to have multiple to-do item, and to-do item is going to call this function and then get this div. And then you can obviously see the benefit of this. Like imagine that I want to change the format of this. Like let's say I want to create, like I want to make this date italic, and then right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4. That means 12 of them. But here I just need to, revise one place. Like this is basically HTML tag for italic, and then save it. It's going to change everything automatically. So this is how React organizes HTML code, and I strongly encourage you to like actually do this on your own, so that you can like reach the point where I am today. And then we're gonna have assignment 5 on React. So like I strongly recommend you to go through this, and then have your own hello world example. Obviously this does not have any functionality, and then we're going to look at states and hooks, and then how we can add like event handler in React code. Okay, so I think that's it for today, and then I'm almost finishing in time, so that's good. Although I was supposed to spend less time because I spent extra time last time, but hopefully that's better than being late. Okay, all right. I'm not exactly sure whether I'm going to have a quiz or not, but if I do, I'm going to make an announcement. But until then, yeah, just wait for the announcement, and I'll see you next week. All right.